Continue with part 3 of Simon's story, the story in which he meets an SS officer who is dying and wants to speak with a Jew. And Simon is continuing as a prisoner marching through the town to a work detail at a location where the SS officer is dying. He hasn't reached that place, and neither does he know that he's going to be asked to meet anybody other than those who would give him work to do as a prisoner, as a Jewish prisoner in Poland. So we continue to read in part 3. I, for one, no longer wanted to look at the indifferent faces of the spectators. Did any of them reflect that there were still Jews? And as long as they were there, as long as the Nazis were still busy with the Jews, they would leave the citizens alone. I suddenly remembered an experience I had a few days before, not far from here. As we were returning to the camp, a man whom I had formerly known passed by, a fellow student, now a Polish engineer. Perhaps understandably, he was afraid to nod to me openly, but I could see from the expression in his eyes that he was surprised to see me still alive. For him, we were as good as dead. Each of us was carrying around his own death certificate, from which only the date was missing. Our column suddenly came to a halt at the crossroads. I could see nothing that might be holding us up, but I noticed on the left of the street there was a military cemetery. It was enclosed by a low barbed wire fence. The wires were threaded through with sparse bushes and low shrubs, but between them you could see the graves aligned in stiff rows. And on each grave there was planted a sunflower, as straight as a soldier on parade. I stared, spellbound. The flower heads seemed to absorb the sun's rays like mirrors and draw them down into the darkness of the ground as my gaze wandered from the sunflower to the grave itself. It seemed to penetrate the earth, and suddenly I saw before me a periscope. It was gaily coloured, and butterflies fluttered from the flower to another flower. Were they carrying messages from one grave to another grave? Were they whispering something to the flower to pass on to the soldier below? Yes, this was just what they were doing. The dead were receiving like messages. Suddenly, I envied the dead soldiers. Each had a sunflower to connect him to the living world and butterflies to visit his grave. For me, there would be no sunflower. I would be buried in a mass grave where corpses would be piled on top of me. No sunflower would ever bring light into my darkness, and no butterflies would dance above the dreadful tomb. I do not know how long we stood there. The man behind gave me a push and the procession started again. As we walked on, I still had my head turned towards the sunflowers. They were countless and indistinguishable from one another. But the men who were buried under them had not severed all connections with the world. Even in death, they were superior to us. I rarely thought of death. I knew that it was waiting for me and must come sooner or later. So gradually I had accustomed myself to its proximity. I was not even curious as to how it would come. There were too many possibilities. All I hoped was that it would be quick. Just how it could happen, I left to fate. But for some strange reason, the sight of the sunflowers had aroused my thoughts. I felt I would come across them again, that they were a symbol with a special meaning for me. As we reached Janaska Street, leaving the cemetery behind us, I turned my head for a last look at the forest of sunflowers. We still did not know where we were being taken. My neighbour whispered to me, perhaps they have set up a new workshop in the ghetto. It was possible. The rumour was that the new workshops were being started. More and more German businessmen were settling in Lemberg. They were not so anxious for profits. It was more important for them to keep their employees and save them from military service, which was comparatively easy in peaceful Lemberg, far from the front line. What most of these enterprises brought with them from Germany was writing paper, a rubber stamp, a few foremen, and some office furniture. Only a short time ago, Lemberg had been in the hands of the Russians, who had nationalized most of the building firms, many of which had previously been owned by Jews. When the Russians withdrew, they were unable to take the machines and tools with them, so what they left behind was taken to the booty depot and was now being divided amongst the newly established German factories. There was no trouble in any case about getting labour. So long as there were Jews, one could get cheap, almost free labour. The workshop applying had merely to be recognised as an important aspect of the war, but a certain degree of protection and bribery was also necessary. Those with connections got permission to set up branches in occupied territory. They were given cheap labour in the shape of hundreds of Jews, and they also had an extensive machine depot at their disposal. The men they brought with them from Germany were exempt from active service. Homes in the German quarter of Lemberg were assigned to them, very nice houses abandoned by wealthy Poles and Jews to make room for the master race. To the Jews, it was an advantage that so many German enterprises were being started in Poland. Work was not particularly hard, and as a rule, the workshop managers fought for their Jews, without whose cheap labour for workshops would have had to move further east, nearer the front. All around me I heard anxious whispers. Where are we going? Going means to carry out with the feet a decision which the brain has formed. But in our case, our brains made no decisions at all. Our feet merely imitated what the front man did. They stopped when they stopped, and they moved on when they moved on. We turned right into Janaska Street. How often had I sauntered along it as a student and later as an architect? For a time I'd even had lodgings there with a fellow student from Primsel. Now we marched mechanically along the street, a column of doomed men. It was not yet 8 o'clock, but there was already plenty of traffic. Peasants were coming into the city to barter their wares. They no longer had confidence in money, as it was always the case in wartime and in crisis. The peasants paid no attention to our column. As we moved out of the city, the Askaris, having sung themselves hoarse, were taking a rest. Detrained soldiers with their baggage hurried along Janaski Street. SS men passed looking contemptuously at us, and at one point an army officer stopped to stare. Around his neck hung a camera, but he could not make up his mind to use it on us. Hesitatingly, he passed the camera from right to left and then let it go again. Perhaps he was afraid of trouble with the SS. We came in sight of the church at the end of Janaska Street, a lofty structure of red brick and squared stone. Which direction would the Askari take us at the head of the column? To the right, down to the station, or to the left, along Safi Street, at the end of which lay a notorious Lonky prison? We turned left. I knew the way well. In Safasi Street stood a technical high school. For years I had walked along this street several times a day when I was working for the Polish diploma. Even then, for us Jewish students, Safi Street was a street of doom. Only a few Jewish families lived there in the times of disorder. The district was avoided by Jews. Here lived Poles, regular officers, professional men, manufacturers and officials. Their sons were known as gilded youth. The gilded youth of Lemberg and they supplied most of the students in the technical high school and in the high school of agriculture. Many of them were rowdies, hooligans, anti-Semites and Jews who fell into their hands were often beaten up and left bleeding on the ground. They fastened razor blades to the end of their sticks, which they used as weapons against Jewish students. In the evenings, it was dangerous to walk through the street, even if one were merely Jewish in appearance, especially at times when the young National Democrats or radical nationals were turning their anti-Jewish slogans from theory into practice. It was rare for the policemen to be around to protect the victims. What was incomprehensible was that at a time when Hitler was on Poland's western frontiers, poised to annex Polish territory, these Polish patriots could think of only one thing: the Jews and their hatred for them. In Germany at that time, they were building new factories to raise armament potential to the maximum. They were building strategic roads straight towards Poland, and they were calling up more and more young Germans for military service. But the Polish Parliament paid little heed to this menace. It had more important tasks, new regulations for kosher butchering, for instance, which might make life more difficult for the Jews. Such parliamentary debates were always followed by street battles, for the Jewish intelligentsia was ever a thorn in the flesh of the anti-Semites. 2 years before the outbreak of war, the radical elements had invented a day without Jews, whereby they hoped to reduce the number of Jewish academics, to interfere with their studies, and to make it impossible for them to take examinations. On these feast days, they were assembled inside the gates of the high schools, a crowd of fraternity students wearing ribbons inscribed, "The Day Without Jews." It always coincided with the examination days. The Day Without Jews was this movable festival, and as the campus of the technical high school was ex-territorial, the police were not allowed to interfere except by express request of the rector. Such requests were rarely made, although the radicals formed a mere 20% of the students. This minority reigned because of the cowardice and laziness of the majority. The great mass of students were unconcerned about the Jews, or indeed about order and justice. They were not willing to expose themselves. They lacked willpower. They were wrapped up in their own problems, completely indifferent to the fate of Jewish students. The proportions were about the same among the teaching staff. Some were confirmed anti-Semites, but even from those who were not, the Jewish students had trouble getting a substitute date for the examinations, which they missed because of the Day Without Jews. For the Jews who came from poor families, the loss of term meant inevitably an end to their studies, so they had to go to the high school, even on the anti-Semitic feast days, and this led to grotesque situations. In the side street, ambulances waited patiently, and they had plenty to do on those examinations days. The police too wanted to prevent violence from spreading outside the campus. From time to time, a few of the most brutal students were arrested and tried, but they emerged from the prison as heroes, and on their lapels they proudly wore a badge designed as a prison gate. They had suffered for their country's cause. Honoured by their comrades, they were given special privileges by some of the professors, and never was there any question of expelling them. Some memories crowded into my mind as, under guard of the Askaris, I marched past the familiar houses. I looked into the faces of the passers-by. Perhaps I would see a former fellow, maybe a fellow student. I would spot him at once, because he would visibly show the hatred and contempt which they always showed at the mere sight of a Jew. I had seen this expression too often during my time as a student never to forget it. Where are they now, these super patriots who dreamt of a Poland without Jews? Perhaps the day when there would be no more Jews was not far off, and their dreams would be realized. Only there wouldn't be a Poland either. So Shabbat Shalom, Mike Frank.